Chapter-9, The Quest. A clear summary of the preceding chapters, together with an introduction to this one, is given by the sage of Arunachala in the following words. Where the ego rises not, there we are that. But how can that perfect egolessness be attained if the mind dives not into its source? And if the ego dies not, how can our natural state be one, wherein we are that? The sage Gautama Buddha once spoke a parable in order to discourage questions about the origin of bondage. He said, "Here you are, bound hand and foot by desire and fear, and here is the straight path to deliverance. And you ask questions about how you came to be bound. They are irrelevant. You should be content to know how you can become free. Do not act like the man who died because he raised untimely questions and insisted on getting answers. You see, this man was going through a forest. An enemy who was waiting for him in an ambush shot him with a poisoned arrow. Accidentally, the wounded man was seen by a friend who went and spread the news. Soon his kinsmen came to him with all the necessary supplies. They wanted to pull out the arrow and apply antidotes to save his life. But the wounded man prevented them, saying, "You must first inquire and find out all the possible details about the enemy. About his caste, whether he is tall or short, fair or dark, and also about the arrow that he made." The kinsmen tried their best to convince him that these questions could wait, and that it was urgently necessary to save his life first by applying the remedies. But the man was obstinate, and precious time was wasted. So he died. The Buddha said, "Be not like this man. Cease questioning. Hear the way to deliverance and follow it." The source of the mind, that from which the mind takes its rise, which is here indicated, is the heart, which, as we have seen before, is to be tentatively regarded as the own abode of the self. Of course, the absolute truth is that the self is itself the real heart. Here the sage refers to the egoless state as our natural state, because there we are what we really are, namely pure consciousness. That the ego must be got rid of is the one thing on which, as the sage tells us, all religions are agreed. They differ only in regard to the nature of the state of deliverance. Once a question was put to the sage: which of the two views is correct? The one that says that God and soul are one, or the opposite one? And the sage said, "Get to the business on the agreed point, namely that the ego must be got rid of." Hence, the essential teaching is that which tells us how to get rid of the ego. All else is of less importance, for what we shall do to win egolessness is far more important than the beliefs, if any, we shall cherish about it, or about the world that keeps us from it. The methods inculcated by the diverse religions for deliverance are all of them right in a way, but the direct method is the one taught by the sage. The other methods just prepare the mind for the right method. They can do no more. The sage explained it this way. The ego cannot be subjugated by one that takes it to be real. It is just like one's own shadow. Imagine a man who does not know the truth of his shadow. He sees it following him persistently and wants to get rid of it. He tries to run away from it, but it still follows him. He digs a deep pit and tries to bury it, filling up the pit. But the shadow comes to the top again and again and follows him. He can get rid of it only by looking away from it, at himself, the origin of the shadow. Then the shadow will not worry him. The seekers of deliverance are like the man in this parable. They fail to see that the ego is but a shadow of the self. What they have to do is to turn away from it, towards the self, Atman, of which it is the shadow. The first thing to do before beginning the quest is to analyze the ego sense and separate the real from the unreal part of it. We have seen already that the ego has an element of reality mixed up in it, namely the light of consciousness, which manifests as I am. This I am, we know, is real because it is the part that is constant and unchanging. We need to reject the unreal part, the sheaths or bodies, and take the remainder, the pure I am. This I am is a clue to the finding of the real self. By holding on to this clue, the sage tells us we can surely find the self. The sage once compared the seeker of the self to a dog seeking his master, from whom he had been parted. The dog has something to guide him, namely the master's scent. And by following the scent, leaving everything else, he ultimately finds his master. The I am in the ego sense is just like the master's scent for the dog. It is the only clue the seeker has for finding the self. But it is an infallible clue. He must get and keep hold of it, fix his mind on it to the exclusion of all other things. It will then surely take his mind to the self, the source of the I am. This inquiry or analysis is like the following. I am not the gross body, because when I dream, another body takes its place. Neither am I the mind, because in deep sleep I continue to exist, though the mind ceases to be, and I remember on waking the two features of sleep, namely the positive one of pure happiness and the negative one of not seeing the world. As mind and body appear fitfully, they are unreal. As I exist continuously, I am real as the pure I am. I can reject these as not myself, because they are objects seen by me. I cannot reject this I am, because it is that from which body and mind are rejected. Hence, the I am is the truth of me. All else is not I. We do not thus arrive at the practical experience of the I am. What we gain by this analysis is just an intellectual grasp of the truth of the self. The self, thus known, is a mere mental abstraction. What we need to experience is the concrete presence of the self. We have seen in the last chapter that to do this, we need to break the vicious circle of the three states. The method by which this vicious circle can be broken is the quest of the self, taught by the sage. We may presume that this was the method followed by the sages of the past. In one place in the Upanishadic lore, we are told that the self must be sought. It appears that the method followed by Gautama Buddha was this. But somehow the secret of this method seems to have been lost. For what we find in the books is not this method, but something else, which we shall call the traditional method. We shall first study this traditional method, which goes as follows. First, the seeker learns the truth of the self as given out in the ancient lore, called the Upanishads. These and other books take the disciple through the philosophical inquiry set forth in the chapters. The self is shown to be not this and not this, neti, neti, and so on, eliminating at each step some one thing that has been taken to be the self. In this way, the gross body, the vital principle, the mind, and the ego are rejected. Or we are taken through the three states of being, and the selves that are experienced in them are shown to be not the self in its natural greatness. What remains over after all these are rejected, we are told, is the real self, Atman, as well as the Supreme Being, the hypothetical cause and sustenance of all the worlds. We are further told that this great being is really unrelated, absolute, formless, nameless, timeless, and spaceless. And it is alone without a second, unchanging and unchangeable, perfect, the principle of happiness which filters down into this world and is the cause of all the enjoyment in it. The next step is for the disciple to reflect on this teaching, especially on the identity of the real self and the great being spoken of. That is, to consider the evidence for and against it. In doing so, he is to remember that the sacred lore is the only evidence he can have of the truth of the real self, which is supersensual and therefore beyond the intellect. The sacred lore is, of course, authoritative because it embodies the testimony of sages that have found the truth. He is next told to employ logic, not for discrediting that testimony, but for accepting it. For logic is by itself barren and can be used either way, according to the predilections of its user. It can lead to no final conclusion of its own. By this reflection, he is to arrive at the conclusion that the sacred teaching is correct, that really the Supreme Being is his innermost real self. And he is to repeat this process until he gets firmly convinced that the truth of the self, Atman, is expressed in the sentence, I am that. The third and last stage of the method is meditation on this teaching. He is to fix his mind on the thought, I am that, to the exclusion of all other thoughts, until he attains perfect concentration on that thought and his mind begins to flow in a steady current of meditation on that thought. The books tell us that if and when this happens, the real self will reveal itself and ignorance and bondage will cease once for all. This is the threefold method as taught in the textbooks. The sage of Arunachala allows that this threefold method has its use. He says it is a good method for purifying and strengthening the mind, so that the mind may become a fit instrument for the quest that is taught by the sage. For the strength of the mind consists in its freedom from distraction by the multiplicity of thoughts that usually arise and dissipate the mind's energy, that is, the pure, peaceful, sattvic aspect of mind, that is very close to the self. And it is unquestionable that only a strong mind can reach the goal, never a weak one. So says the ancient lore, as well as the sage of Arunachala, who puts it this way: the direct method of winning the real self is diving into the heart, seeking the source of the I am. The meditation, I am not this, I am that, is of course helpful, but it is not itself the method of finding the self. In fact, the sage of Arunachala, speaking to a visitor, once said, "You are told that the ego is not your real self. If you accept it, then you have only to search for and find that which is your real self, the real being of which the ego is a false appearance. Why then do you meditate, I am that? That only gives a fresh lease of life to the ego. It is like someone trying to avoid thinking of a monkey when taking medicine. For by the very act of trying, he admits the thought. The source or truth of the ego must be traced and found. Meditating, I am that, is of no use. For meditation is by the mind, and the self is beyond the mind. In the quest of its own reality, the ego perishes of itself. Hence, this is the direct method. In all other methods, the ego is retained, and hence so many doubts arise, and the eternal question remains to be faced. And until that question is faced, there will be no end to the ego. Then why not face that question at once, without going through those other methods? Whatever assumes the reality of the ego, whether explicitly or by implication, would even take us further away from the goal, which is the egoless state, if we do not beware. The sage of Arunachala criticizes this method as follows. If one goes on meditating, I am not this, I am that, instead of winning the natural state of deliverance, which is indicated by the Upanishadic text, thou art that, by pursuing with one pointed mind the quest, who am I, it is due to mere weakness of the mind. For that reality is ever shining as the self. Here it is pointed out that the Upanishadic text, thou art that, tells us the fact that the self experienced in the egoless state is the supreme reality. It therefore means that we should win the egoless state by the direct method. It does not tell us to meditate, I am that. From the text, we must understand that by a single effort we shall win two seemingly different things, namely the self and the Supreme Being, because both are one and the same.